So, Jujutsu Kaisen is known for having a confusing power system where almost everything has a similar sounding name. That's why, for today's video, we're explaining all the important concepts, and by the end you'll know the difference between maximum output, maximum techniques, domain expansion, domain amplification, and anything else a sorcerer might use. To start things off, the very first concept we need to mention is cursed energy, and we can think of this as the fuel source that makes everything else possible. Cursed energy, otherwise known as CE, is made from negative human emotions, and so when most people feel angry or scared or upset, the energy just leaks out their bodies without them even realizing. However, when it comes to Jujutsu sorcerers, these are people who have special brains and are able to control this energy instead of just wasting it. Most sorcerers are trained to use CE regardless of how they're feeling, and a great example of how they might use it is cursed energy reinforcement. Reinforcement is when someone improves their physical stats using cursed energy. For instance, Yuta barely has any muscle, but with reinforcement, he becomes stronger than the strongest Olympian. In one chapter, he threw a whole car at Yuji without even breaking a sweat, and in the show, he sliced the car in half with a katana. When using reinforcement, a person can enhance their strength, their durability, their speed, or a combination of all three, and I'd say it's one of the very few things that every single sorcerer uses. Without reinforcement, characters would instantly die from the damage they have to take, and also without reinforcement, their attacks wouldn't be this powerful. Understandably though, not everyone can be reinforced to the level of Yuta or Sukuna, and one of the reasons for this is their cursed energy reserves. For context, cursed energy reserves refers to the total amount of CE that a sorcerer has inside their body. Usually this amount is predetermined at birth, so you can't permanently increase it unless you're the main character. If a sorcerer gets creative though, there are certain ways to temporarily increase your reserves, like Mechamaru did when he stored years worth of CE inside these puppets. By doing what he did, it meant that he had control over more cursed energy than would usually be in his system, and he's not the only person to augment his reserves in one way or another. The benefit of having large reserves is that you have more gas in the tank, and this gas lets you reinforce yourself with bigger amounts of cursed energy. Large reserves also means it takes you longer to run out of CE, and on top of that, it gives you more options during battle. What I mean by this is that in JJK, there are certain big moves that require huge amounts of cursed energy, and so if you have bigger reserves, then you can do more of those moves back to back. I should point out though, having huge reserves doesn't always mean that you'll have high output, which is a phrase you probably heard in Season 3. When characters talk about output, they're usually referring to the amount of cursed energy that's being put into a single action. This action might be releasing a simple blast of cursed energy, or it might be something more complicated. The point is that the more cursed energy you put into something, the higher the output is, and the higher the output is, the more powerful the action will be. If we look at this diagram, you can see that each sorcerer has a limit to their output, and this limit varies from person to person. In most fights, characters rarely use this full amount, and if they do, they'll say out loud that they're using their max output. When they say this, it means they're putting as much CE as possible into this one move, and it's the strongest version of the attack that they can do. Like I said though, most sorcerers aren't doing this all the time, because if you're constantly using your max output, then your reserves will get drained pretty quickly. If your reserves run out, then you won't be able to even reinforce yourself. So yeah, it's a good idea to not go crazy with the output, and they use like 80 to 90%, but they're not going 100% all the time. By the way, I mentioned earlier that having top tier reserves doesn't mean that your output will be on the same tier, and the perfect examples of this are Yuta and Ryu. In this series, Yuta has the second biggest reserves, meaning they're bigger than everyone except Sukuna, but his output is still lower than Ryu, who has smaller reserves. On a normal day, what this means is that Yuta has way more gas in the tank, and in a pure 1v1 fight, he should last longer. However, because Ryu has the higher output, his attacks should do more damage, and they have the potential to break through Yuta's reinforcement. One thing we do have to say though, is that if a person is tired or injured or exhausted in some way, then that might cause their output to temporarily be lower than normal. With all that said, cursed techniques are the next concept we need to talk about, and they are unique abilities that are usually different for each person. Throughout JJK, we've seen techniques that can manipulate space, manipulate reality, generate clones, and control cockroaches. Pretty much anything you can think of, there's a technique that might do it. Importantly though, these abilities can't be learnt by just anyone. In fact, 99% of the time, you just have to be born with it. Sorcerers with these powers are born with the techniques engraved into their brain, and when they get older, they can activate the techniques by using CE. Essentially, CE is the fuel that allows curse techniques to function, and fueling your technique is a form of curse energy output. If we look at Gojo as an example, his limitless curse technique is obviously one of the best, and when he fuels it with CE, there are a few things that he can do. In its most basic form, when the limitless curse technique receives curse energy, it warps the space around Gojo and makes it so that space becomes endless. If someone tries to touch him, they'll never reach his actual body, because to reach Gojo, you have to go through infinite space, which is impossible. As a result, he has the best defense in the series since no one can physically touch him, but remember, it only works when he fuels it with curse energy. In the present day, Gojo has certain skills that allow him to do this 24/7, but for most sorcerers, fueling your technique 24/7 is a bad idea because you'd either run out of CE or you just fry your own brain. Now, earlier we explained that a person can strengthen their curse energy by increasing the output, and in Gojo's case, when he fuels his technique with stronger curse energy, it creates an effect known as blue. According to the JJK guidebook, blue is created by adding CE with more CE and then putting that strengthened CE into the limitless curse technique. The end result is this blue attractive force that just pulls things into it, and I guess it functions sort of like a giant magnet. At its best, blue can be used to destroy an environment or crush people to death, and if Gojo wants to, he can also use blue to enhance his physical attacks. Anyhow, the next concept is curse technique reversal, which is when a technique does the opposite of its normal function. To explain this concept, we also need to talk about reverse curse technique, so we're going to do both of them at the same time. If we start with reverse curse technique, also known as RCT, you can see on screen, RCT is a positive type of energy, whereas curse energy is negative energy. In the video so far, we've seen what negative energy can do. I mean, it's good for attacking people, good for strengthening yourself, and good for powering curse techniques. Whereas positive energy is mainly used for healing people. People with RCT can use it to regenerate their missing body parts and heal from pretty much any physical injury. In order to generate RCT, a sorcerer needs to harness curse energy and then multiply that curse energy with itself. Multiplying curse energy is what creates positive energy, but for most characters this is way too difficult. If we look at the full context, the average sorcerer has the ability to add curse energy with itself to create a higher output, but the idea of multiplication is a completely different concept. For that reason, only the truly elite sorcerers can do it, and there are only 3 of them who've been shown to heal other people with RCT. It was confirmed by Principal Yaga that even Gojo isn't able to heal others, so the ones who can do it are insanely talented. A secondary benefit of RCT is that this positive energy is dangerous to cursed spirits, and for context, cursed spirits are life forms that are made from negative energy. In the season finale of JJK Season 3, Yuta outputted RCT through his mouth directly into a special grade curse, and within seconds the curse just exploded. All that being said, the downside to RCT is that it drains your reserves by a lot since the multiplication process uses a ton of curse energy. This is why during the culling game, Yuta ran out way quicker than he normally would, because he was constantly taking damage and having to heal himself just non-stop. Now that we've explained RCT, it's time to talk about curse technique reversal, which is when someone fuels their technique using positive energy. Given that positive energy is the opposite of negative energy, it makes sense that fueling your technique with RCT would make it do the opposite of its normal effect. In Gojo's case, this means the attractive force of blue is turned into a repulsive force known as red. As we've seen, red is great for blasting people away, and because it's powered by RCT, its output is over double the strength of blue. Again, the reason for this is pretty simple, is because blue is fueled only by curse energy, whereas red is fueled by curse energy that's been multiplied with itself, so by default the output is going to be higher. Moving on, the next concept we should talk about are extension techniques, which are when sorcerers are at their most creative. The guidebook describes extensions as original jujutsu based on a curse technique, and Megami Fushiguro is a great example. Fushiguro's technique gives him the power to summon creatures known as Shikigami, and in total, there are 10 Shikigami that he can summon at any time. However, by extending his technique, he was able to fuse his Toad Shikigami with his Bird Shikigami to create these flying frogs. These frogs are a totally original creation from him, and they can be destroyed without any consequences. This is different to his regular Shikigami, which can permanently be killed, so yeah, having an extension does have certain benefits. When it comes to Gojo, his extension is referred to as Hollow Purple, and it occurs when you combine the repulsive force of red with the attractive force of blue, and when put together, it creates this purple mass that just destroys everything. The only way someone might survive Hollow Purple is to reinforce themselves with a godly amount of cursed energy, and even then you'll probably end up losing a limb. In that sense, Gojo's extension is actually his most destructive attack, and is clearly more effective than shooting out raw cursed energy. Now, although I said that Hollow Purple was his most destructive attack, I didn't say that it was his most effective attack, because his most effective attack is a domain expansion. Domain expansions are the highest level of sorcery that a person can achieve, and to explain this concept, we need to talk about innate domains. An innate domain is something everyone has, even regular civilians, and it's best to think of it as a place that exists inside the soul. When Yuji first died, his soul went into Sukuna's innate domain, and it was there that they made a deal where Sukuna healed him with RCT. Now, if a sorcerer is skilled enough, they can use massive amounts of cursed energy to construct their innate domain in the real world. At the same time, while they construct this domain inside a barrier, they have to activate their curse technique, and basically imbue their technique into the domain. If you follow these steps, then you'll have a domain expansion, and from the outside, it looks like just a big black barrier. Inside this barrier, a sorcerer gains several advantages over their opponent, so let's go through them step by step. Firstly, every domain has a sure hit effect, which is an effect that's guaranteed to hit the target regardless of what their technique might be. Even if Gojo was trapped inside a domain, his limitless technique would not protect him from a sure hit effect, but for attacks that aren't a sure hit, then yeah, he would still be able to defend himself. Some examples of sure hit effects include Sukuna's slashes, Mahito's soul manipulation, and Dagon's Shikigami that bite the target. If we examine the sure hit effect of Limitless, this sure hit effect floods the victim's brain with infinite information, to the point their brain becomes overwhelmed. This always results in the victim being paralyzed, leaving Gojo free to do whatever he wants. We've seen that the length of time someone stays paralyzed varies depending on how strong they are and also how long the domain was open, so yeah, the results vary, but for the most part it's long enough for him to kill whoever's inside. The secondary benefit of all domain expansions is that both the sorcerer and their technique get a temporary boost in strength. If we look at Megami, for example, inside his domain, he can summon multiple copies of the same Shikigami, something he never does, and I don't think he can do it outside of his domain. He's also able to make clones of himself out of the shadows, which again is something his technique never normally does. This boost in stats gives the sorcerer a massive advantage, and it's partly why domains are the quickest way to win a fight. Thirdly, some domains have rules that the victim has to follow. For instance, Higuruma's domain forces everyone to take part in a trial, and it also prevents all violence. On top of that, Higuruma still has a sure hit effect that activates under certain conditions, and the effect I'm referring to is confiscation, where he forcibly takes away the victim's curse technique, and if they don't have a technique, then it forcibly takes away their curse energy. In that sense, the domain has multiple different layers, and that it forces you to take part, it prevents violence, which is kind of a binding vow that we'll talk about later, and it also has a sure hit effect, so it has multiple things going on to trap the victim and to force them to play along with his game. Now, even though domains are amazing, they still come with huge downsides, and the first downside is that it drains more curse energy than literally anything else. Usually, this means a sorcerer can only open one domain expansion per day, and anyone who can do more than that is just a freak of nature. The second downside is that shortly after a domain is closed, the sorcerer's curse technique becomes burnt out, and they have to wait for an unknown period of time until they can use it properly again. In chapter 227, Yuta compared being burnt out to an engine overheating, and he says that just like an engine, you have to wait for your technique to cool down. Technically speaking, a person can use RCT to get their technique back pretty quickly, but doing this causes genuine brain damage and is not recommended. The third drawback is that because domains are designed to trap people, the inside of the barrier is usually tough to prevent people escaping, while the outside of the barrier is usually pretty weak. This means it's quite simple to break into a domain like Yuji did, and it also means that domains can be totally destroyed by an outside force. The outside force I'm referring to is an open domain, which is a type of domain expansion that doesn't have a barrier. The main benefit of an open domain is that it has a really wide range while still maintaining a good level of output. For comparison, Sukuna's open domain can extend 200 meters in every direction, whereas a normal domain barrier isn't even close to that size. Now, while it is true that a regular domain can be expanded to be an even bigger barrier, the fact is that if you do this, you reduce the quality of the sure hit effect. By contrast, open domains are huge and they still maintain a solid level of output, but of course the one downside is that there's no barrier to trap people inside. To put it another way, open domains are good if you're trying to kill a ton of people at once, but in a 1v1 fight, there's only one reason you would use it. If a regular domain faces off against an open domain, the open domain can attack the regular domain from the outside. I mentioned earlier that the outer shell of a domain expansion is normally pretty weak, so an open domain can easily break this shell using its sure hit effect. That being said, if the outside shell happens to be strong for some reason, then the user of the open domain can still destroy it by reducing the range of their own domain, because if you do that, then you boost the strength of the sure hit effect. Last thing to say before we go on to the next topic is that if two regular domains are clashing with each other, then the more refined domain should win. This is what Gojo said back in the first season, and to be perfectly honest, it's never exactly explained what refinement is, although I imagine output plays a big factor, but yeah, it's never exactly explained. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Moving on, the next few concepts we're going to talk about are anti-domain techniques, which are skills that might help someone survive if they get trapped in a domain expansion. In history, the first ever anti-domain technique was called Hollow Wicker Basket, and it's activated by sticking your arms out and locking your fingers together. When Hollow Wicker Basket is active, the only thing it does is protect the user from the sure hit effect of a domain. As a quick demonstration, let's imagine that Gojo opens his domain and traps Kashimo inside, and for the sake of example, let's just say that Kashimo opened Hollow Wicker Basket instantly. In this scenario, Kashimo would be safe from the info trying to flow into his brain, and he wouldn't become paralyzed like most people. However, Hollow Wicker Basket has two major downsides. The first is that, although you're protected from the sure hit, you're not protected from anything else. This is why when Reggie used Hollow Wicker Basket in Megami's domain, Fushiguro was still able to punch him and restrain him with the Shikigami. The second drawback is that the user of Hollow Wicker Basket has to maintain this hand side, which means that unless you have 4 arms, you won't really be able to defend yourself. If you're wondering why people have to maintain the hand sign, the answer is that maintaining the sign increases the output of Hollow Wicker Basket, and it allows it to last longer against a real domain expansion. If the hands weren't together, then the output would be weak, and if it has a weak output, then a real domain would destroy it in seconds. Now, the next anti-domain technique is called Simple Domain, and it can be used for both defending yourself and also attacking. Throughout Jujutsu Kaisen, Simple Domain has had many different forms, and that's because different people are able to program it to do different things. If we start with its most basic form, pretty much every Simple Domain creates a space for the user, aka a domain, and inside this space, they're protected from the sure hit of a domain expansion. On top of that, you don't have to keep your hands together like Hollow Wicker Basket, but the output of the Simple Domain, that will almost never be greater than a domain expansion. You might be wondering why this is important. Well, the answer is that at some point, a domain expansion will always overpower a Simple Domain. If you want some examples, Yuki's Simple Domain was destroyed in a few seconds, Gojo's Simple Domain was destroyed just as quickly, and then when he made another one, it was quickly destroyed again. The amount of time it lasts will largely depend on the output of your opponent, and to be fair, both Yuki and Gojo were fighting against healthy special grade sorcerers. With that said, we've now explained the basic form of Simple Domain, but of course there are more advanced versions. The best proof of this is the grade 1 sorcerer Kusakabe, who's the master of the New Shadow Style. The New Shadow Style is a school that's existed for 1,000 years, and it teaches its students about Simple Domain. In the modern era, Kusakabe is their most skilled member, and he has multiple different versions of the technique. One version is called Simple Domain Evening Moon Sword EI, and it has 5 total effects. Effect number 1, it protects him from a domain expansion sure hit effect. Effect number 2, it raises his curse energy output while inside the Simple Domain. Effect number 3, his opponent's technique is weakened, so if they attack him inside the Simple Domain, the attack won't have the intended power. Effect number 4, the Simple Domain has a program that basically takes over his body and causes him to respond automatically to anything that enters his domain. In other words, Kusakabe doesn't have to think, the technique just automatically makes him move. Finally, effect number 5, Kusakabe has the skill to expand the size of his Simple Domain, and by doing this quickly, he can bring someone into this space. When that happens, his program kind of takes over and makes Kusakabe attack whoever's inside, so in this situation, the Simple Domain is being used for offense instead of defense. Other versions of Simple Domain can also be programmed for attacking purposes, which is why you'll see people use it even when they're not trapped in a domain expansion. I also wanted to say that some simple domains do look very similar to a domain expansion, but it's important to remember they are not domain expansions because they either don't have a sure hit effect that's guaranteed to hit the target, or they don't have a curse technique that's been imbued into the barrier. Switching over to the third anti-domain technique, this one is named Falling Blossom Emotion. Falling Blossom Emotion has one benefit over Simple Domain, and for context, we've already established that Simple Domain can easily be destroyed by a domain expansion, and this is because Simple Domain is a barrier technique that gets overwhelmed by a more powerful barrier. However, Falling Blossom Emotion doesn't have this problem because it's not a barrier technique. Instead, the user simply coats themselves in their own curse energy. That curse energy is then programmed to respond to sure hit effects, and so when trapped in a domain, the user has a chance of survival. In JJK Season 2, we saw Naobito using this, and it honestly worked really well against the sure hit, but he was still able to get damaged by a punch. This is because Falling Blossom Emotion is great at countering basic curse techniques, so stuff like slashes or curse energy blasts, it can mostly defend well against that. What it can't do though is defend against regular brute force punches, and it also can't defend against complex powers like Limitless, so it's not perfect. One downside that I forgot to mention is that if you're facing someone who's insanely powerful, Falling Blossom Emotion won't even negate the sure hit. What it will do is reduce the damage, but you might still get injured. The last thing to say about this power is similar to Simple Domain, you can use it for attacking purposes. If you remember this scene when Ogi Zenin was about to fight against Maki, he coated himself and his sword with Falling Blossom Emotion. When using it in this way, Falling Blossom Emotion will attack anything that touches the user's cursed energy. This is why, even in complete darkness, Ogi countered Maki as soon as she entered his space. Now, moving over to the next concept, this is Domain Amplification. And Domain Amplification is a highly advanced skill that negates your opponent's curse technique. To explain how it works, I thought it would be good to compare it with a domain expansion, since the concepts are like two sides of the same coin. If we look at this comparison, on the left we can see that a domain expansion only has two steps, which are to expand your innate domain over a wide area, and then imbue that domain with your curse technique. As we know, this has the effect of trapping your opponent inside, and it gives you a big attacking advantage. By contrast, with domain amplification, the guidebook describes it as a domain that you expand over your own body. Gojo once compared it to like being surrounded by water, and if we stick with that metaphor, this water hasn't been imbued with a curse technique. In other words, you can think of domain amplification as an empty space that's waiting for a curse technique to be put inside it. For that reason, if a person using domain amplification makes contact with someone else's curse technique, then their opponent's technique will start flowing into their amplification. This is exactly what Jogo and Hanami were doing in Season 2, as Gojo's Limitless technique began flowing into their empty space. If Gojo had allowed this to continue, then eventually the two of them would have bypassed his defenses and physically touched him. Additionally, amplification is also the best way to reduce damage from a technique. So, for instance, one character used it to nullify Sukuna's slashes, and according to Sukuna, it's even more effective than a simple domain. Amplification can also protect you from the sure hit effect of a domain expansion, but the downside to this is that when amplification is on, you can't use your own curse technique. This is why during Season 2, in the moments when Jogo is using amplification, you never see him using his flames at the same time. It's also why Hanami turned off her domain amplification, because she wanted to use her technique and it wasn't possible while amplification was on. Anyhow, that was honestly a mouthful, but hopefully everything so far makes sense, and so we're moving on to the next topic, which is binding vows. In its most simple form, binding vows are a contract that are made using cursed energy, and these vows usually involve sacrificing something in order to gain something else. In total, there are 3 distinct types of binding vows. The first kind are vows that you make with other people, the second is vows that are forced on you at birth, and there are vows that you make with yourself. A quick example of a vow between multiple people is the deal that Mechamaru had made with Mahito. In this deal, Mechamaru agreed to betray his friends by providing info to the villains, and in exchange, Mahito agreed to heal his soul. Because both sides followed the contract, nothing bad actually happened, but if one of them had broken it, the binding vow would give that person an unknown punishment. Even Kenjaku, who's 1,000 years old, he had no idea what the punishment would be, but the fact he was even concerned about it, it lets you know that it is something major. The second type of vow is called a heavenly restriction, which is a vow that gets placed on someone's soul without their consent. Just like regular vows, the person loses something in order to gain something, and in Toji's case, he lost all the curse energy he was supposed to have, but in exchange, he gained superhuman strength. Thanks to JJK Modulo, we know that the amount of strength you gain is proportionate to the amount of curse energy that you were meant to have. So, to put it another way, if Ajichi had a heavenly restriction, he would still be super weak. The fact Toji was as powerful as he was, it strongly indicates that he could have been a special grade sorcerer, but for whatever reason, fate decided that it was better for him to be a homeless assassin. Lastly, the final type of vow is a vow that someone makes with themselves, and normally this involves decreasing one aspect of your strength in order to gain strength in something else. Nanami is a character who did this every day because he had a binding vow that reduced his output by 10 to 20% during the normal working day. However, if he had to work overtime for whatever reason, his output would increase by up to 10 to 20%, making his attack stronger than his normal maximum output. The great thing about vows like this is that there's essentially no risk, because even if you break the vow, the only thing you lose is the power that you gained. To put it another way, if Nanami was to break his vow and use his full output during normal working hours, then his only punishment is that his overtime output would stop being boosted to this level. That being said, it is possible to make a permanent binding vow with yourself, and the saddest example of this was Miwa. In JJK Season 2, Miwa thought that she could kill a special grade sorcerer by making a vow that put all of her potential into this one attack. The deal was that after this attack was done, she could never swing a katana again, and remember, her entire fighting style revolves around having a sword. Unfortunately, even when combining all of her present and future potential into one, she was still nothing compared to Kinjaku, and he just easily blocked it with his reinforced hand. Following this, he then instantly tried to kill her with his maximum technique, which is the next topic we're going to explain. In the Jujutsu world, maximum techniques were described as the most advanced skill a sorcerer can have, besides a domain expansion. If we think of curse techniques as Pokemon evolutions, the base form is the technique itself, and the evolved form is extension techniques, which are an evolved way of using that power. Maximum techniques would be the final evolution, since they represent the full potential of what the base technique can achieve. As you can see, we've used Jogo's technique for the illustration, since his disaster flames produce fire in their base form, while having extensions that include miniature volcanoes and insect shikigami. However, his maximum technique was a giant flaming meteorite, which is what this technique looks like when it's been fully mastered by the user. Geto's maximum technique also caused widespread destruction, as it allows him to combine as many curse spirits as he wants and then condense all of their energy into a single blast. Usually, his technique lets him tame one curse spirit at a time, and so the idea of combining thousands of them into one solid blast of curse energy, it would take an incredible amount of skill. The name of this move was Maximum Uzumaki, and when he does this, when he combines all the spirits together, if there are any strong curses like Mahito's level, then he's able to absorb that curse's curse technique and essentially use it for himself one time. The clearest example is this scene when Kinjaku used Idol Transfiguration on basically the whole country, which is something that Mahito himself wouldn't have been able to do because he doesn't have the same level of skill when it comes to barrier techniques. And so that's the reason why Kinjaku took it from him, because Mahito just couldn't have done this. From this, I think it's clear that maximum techniques are all about skill, and they're all about increasing the skill cap of the technique to a point where it just can't be surpassed. Like, there's nothing more that you can do with this power. This is what makes it so different from maximum output, because as we explained before, maximum output is all about fueling your technique at 100%. Fueling something at 100% is very different from mastering something to 100%. One of them is about skill and the other one is about power. And so they're two very different concepts that may overlap on some occasions. When I say that they might overlap, I mean that it is possible for someone to use a maximum technique while also giving it 100% output. And in that scenario, you would be doing two things. You'd be doing max output with a maximum technique. But we have to acknowledge that they are still two separate concepts that just have similar sounding names. With that said, the next two concepts are even more closely related, and they are curse energy efficiency and curse energy control. If a person has good curse energy control, it means that CE flows throughout their body exactly how they want it to, and they can use that fuel to do multiple tasks at the same time, or even maybe they can switch between different tasks without any delay. One of the best examples of what control means is when Gojo was able to open a simple domain while healing his body with RCT at the exact same time. As we know, RCT requires positive energy, while simple domain requires negative energy, yet somehow Gojo is fueling both of these two things simultaneously. Shortly after, he then used RCT to reduce the cooldown period for his curse technique, which is something that even Sukuna hadn't seen before. Once his technique recovered, Gojo then instantly used curse technique reversal, followed up by using more RCT to heal the rest of his body. Once he was fully healed, he then whipped out a domain expansion, and he altered the conditions of that domain so that the outside shell would be strong compared to normal domain expansions. Thanks to Kusakabe, we know that this level of cursed energy control is unnatural because he's switching between multiple high-level tasks and switching between positive energy and negative energy just at the flip of a hat, like he's just doing things that shouldn't be done. If we had to list the top 3 reasons why Gojo can do all of these things back to back, I say that number 1, he has great CE control, number 2, he has huge reserves, and number 3, he has the best curse energy efficiency. To explain how efficiency works, on this diagram we have Gojo and Yuta, and next to them are their curse energy reserves. At the beginning of each day, this is how much CE is in both of their systems, and clearly Yuta's reserves are a lot bigger than Gojo's. However, if both of them were to open an equal domain expansion with the same conditions, Yuta's reserves would be drained by this much, while Gojo would only go down by this tiny amount. This is entirely because Gojo has better efficiency, and one of the reasons his efficiency is so good is due to the Six Eyes. The Six Eyes is a genetic trait that exists within the Gojo clan, and it allows him to see curse energy in microscopic detail. As a result, when he does anything that requires curse energy, he's able to use the minimum amount that's humanly possible to complete the task. By contrast, Yuta will often use way more CE than he needs to, and this is actually his biggest failing as a sorcerer. When reinforcing himself, Yuta just lets his curse energy overflow into this massive cloud, whereas most skilled sorcerers will reinforce themselves with a thin layer that's equally spread across their body. Doing this makes it harder for an opponent to predict their next move because, having good control, it means you don't make it obvious when you're about to do something. In that sense, you can see a clear overlap between CE control and CE efficiency because sorcerers who have good control are usually more efficient. Yuta is a bit weird in that he has good control in some areas but poor control in other areas, and this leads to a lack of efficiency, meaning he wastes more CE than he needs to. The only reason he gets away with it is because his reserves are so large and they overflow so much that it's still hard to predict what he's going to do because it's just everywhere. What's interesting about this power system though is that even though Gojo has perfect control and perfect efficiency, there's still one concept that he's not able to consistently use. The name of that move is Black Flash, and it's a concept that amplifies the strength of curse energy. In chapter 48, we found out that Black Flash takes place when a sorcerer lands a physical hit and then adds CE to that hit 0.000001 seconds later. To be this precise, you need to have an insane level of control, and the result is that space becomes distorted and the curse energy flashes black. In this black form, the strength of the impact is raised to the power of 2.5. And if we look at this visually on the screen, you can see that on the left is Yuji's normal punch, and on the right is his punch with Black Flash. Given that Black Flash is all about control and concentration, you'd expect that someone like Gojo could just use this whenever he wants, since, as we know, his precision is the best, and his timing, he could get this timing right every time if he wanted to. The problem for Gojo is that Black Flash has a lot of different factors that go into it, including the temperature, the humidity of the air, and even your opponent's curse energy. All of these variables interact with the user's curse energy, and Black Flash will only happen when everything lines up perfectly. This is why even Gojo himself isn't able to do it at will, although if you're the main character, it might be a different story. One last thing to say about this is that doing a Black Flash might cause a sorcerer to enter the zone, which is just a level of extreme concentration, and in this state, it makes it more likely for them to hit multiple Black Flashes in a row. When a sorcerer is in the zone, it's like unlocking a new part of your brain because you're just able to think of solutions using curse energy that you wouldn't normally think of. And one example is how Gojo designed a circuit within his brain in order to recover his reverse curse technique. Now, as you probably know, most sorcerers out there don't have the skills to do Black Flash, but this next concept is something even the weakest sorcerers can do. This concept is known as a curtain, although sometimes it's referred to as a veil, and it's a barrier technique that can be learnt by pretty much anyone. When JJK began, the existence of curses and sorcerers was meant to be a secret, and so curtains would be used to hide their activity. When a non-sorcerer looks at a curtain, they don't see anything. In fact, all they see is how the environment used to look before the curtain was put up. Of course, there are some non-sorcerers like Junpei who were able to perceive curse energy, and for those people, yeah, they will see curtains from the inside or the outside, but it's just such a small amount of people that it's not really important. If a sorcerer is skilled enough, then it's also possible to customize the rules of a curtain. For instance, this curtain had a rule that allowed anyone to enter except Gojo. These conditions work like binding vows in that in order to gain something, you have to also sacrifice something. We saw a great example of this in Shibuya where there were a ton of different curtains, and in particular there was this one curtain that seemed unbreakable. One of the reasons it was so strong is that you could actually break the curtain by breaking these talismans, and the fact is that these talismans, they were sitting on top of one of the most obvious buildings in Shibuya, and so by making it so obvious and by being in a place where the heroes would likely want to look, it meant that the curtain became stronger because they were putting themselves at a disadvantage. Also, one of the side effects of curtains is that they usually block phone signals and radio waves, so for most of the time you're not able to communicate with the outside. Okay, so we're finally down to the last few concepts, so we're going to give each of these a quick summary. To start things off, we have residuals, which are remnants of curse energy that get left behind when someone uses their technique. In Shibuya, Gojo left residuals everywhere after his fight with Kinjaku's group, and the aura of his residuals was so intense that curses avoided the area even after he was gone. On the other hand, because residuals are unique to each person, some sorcerers might have very faint residuals that are easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The concept after this is curse energy traits, which is when someone's curse energy has unique properties that make it stand out in some way. The most obvious examples are Kashimo and Hikari, since one of them has electric curse energy that's even more deadly than most curse techniques, and the other has jagged curse energy that feels like sandpaper. Also, Yuji once said that Yuta's curse energy felt creepy, although creepiness doesn't really affect anything, but it's just interesting that it has a different vibe to most other sorcerers. Anyhow, the third concept is curse energy targeting, and it's the idea that CE can be used to target abstract concepts. If we look at Nanami, for example, his technique was good for destroying objects and for hurting people if he wanted to, but what he couldn't do was target the soul. Someone like Yuji, for example, because of his understanding of the soul, he was able to specifically target that when attacking people. And likewise, Sukuna had the ability to make his slashes target the fabric of space itself. Most sorcerers cannot target the fabric of space itself, but if you have enough skill, you're able to extend the target of your curse energy. And in theory, it's something any sorcerer can learn to do. Next up, we have a concept that in the official translation it's referred to as an occurrence, although if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was referred to as a spark in the fan translations. The idea behind a spark is that just before a person uses their technique, their curse energy has to gather somewhere inside them. That specific curse energy is their spark, and it's the CE that's used to power a specific move. A skilled sorcerer will be able to identify the spark of another person. For example, Kusakabe observed Sukuna's spark, or at least that's what's implied by this panel, and through that, he was able to guess the direction of Sukuna's slashes. If a skilled sorcerer was to watch Gojo as well, then they'd be able to have an idea of what he was about to do. Whether it was red, blue, or hollow purple, there'd be a split second where they'd see the spark and have a rough idea what was coming. Lastly, one of the final concepts we need to talk about is Divergent Fist, which is a move that's only ever been used by Yuji. Early on in the series, Gojo explained that because Yuji's CE control was so bad, and because his physical stats were so good, his curse energy couldn't keep up with his physical movements. This meant Yuji was dishing out 2 punches for the price of 1, because he had the initial hit with his superhuman strength, and then his curse energy was following it up. If we think about it, Divergent Fist is the inverse of Black Flash, because as we know, Black Flash is all about extreme precision, whereas Divergent Fist, it only exists because of Yuji's poor control. One last topic I wanted to squeeze in at the end here was curse chants. And curse chants are basically words that sorcerers can say to amplify their curse energy. Usually, most sorcerers don't do this because in the words of chapter 223, to excel at Jujutsu is to excel at subtraction. In other words, when you're good at Jujutsu, you don't need to do all of this, but if you really need that boost of power, then yeah, chanting might be useful. To be fair, we've only seen this done a handful of times, but it was quite interesting to see Sukuna do it with his second mouth, because that's just such a hack, because you're able to power yourself up and you don't even have to talk. You're just using a spare mouth and a spare set of arms to power yourself up. With all that said, my friends, that was the power system of JJK, and we've gone through basically all of the things that a sorcerer can do with their own body. For this video, we didn't speak about cursed tools since not everyone has access to that, but if you think it's worth doing a video on the best tools, then let me know in the comments down below. As always, don't forget to sub as we are trying to hit 600k this year, and also thank you for watching till the end. If this video helps you in any way, then be sure to leave a comment down below, and until the next one, peace out.